as Heather said, I work for Wilson Engineers here in Salina, and I tell everyone that I saw all of the city's facilities from the inside out because I spent most of my time on a construction project, either at a water plant or a wastewater plant. So it was natural for me to go to work for the city as the Director of Utilities. So in my presentation tonight, I'm sharing a lot of information that's been provided in other public meetings from the Airport Authority, the DRAGUN Corporation, Kansas Department of Health and Environment. So I can't take credit for coming up with all the information, but I did compile it and try to put it into a presentation. And it's really hard to talk about nearly 100 years in 30 minutes. So they also asked me to make this entertaining. And after watching that movie, I'm kind of heartbroken to think how I could be entertaining and be uplifting after that. That was a fantastic movie. I really enjoyed it. So the topic for my presentation is the Schilling Air Force Base contamination cleanup. And my duty will be to let the person upstairs know when to transfer the slide. So I'm not sure how I'll accomplish that.
She can hear you.
She can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, next slide, please. So, in my presentation tonight, I'm going to talk about the history out at the Schilling Air Force Base, some of the roles and responsibilities from the city to all of the public entities that have property out there, to the contractor that's worked for us out of Michigan, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, and we'll talk. I think we lost our connection there. Or did we bounce back and forth between the PowerPoint, or how does this work so I don't get you confused? I just keep going.
You just keep going.
Keep going. All right, that's what I'll do then. So I'll talk about the history, and we'll be discussing soil, the surface water, groundwater, and the bedrock, and how it was contaminated out at the site. I'll talk about health risks that were examined to determine what we should do for the remedial actions. Also talk about the Kansas Department of Health and Environment's corrective action decision, which really talks about how the project direction goes to get the contamination cleaned up. And then I'll going to end up with the DRAGUN Corporation's remedial design that they're doing, which will have some estimated costs and a project schedule to get everything cleaned up. Have some time for discussion and questions, but if anybody has a question as we go and I'm not clear, will you just raise your hand and maybe holler at me, and we'll try to answer it then, so you don't have to remember till the end, if that'd be okay. So next slide, please. The Schilling Air Force Base opened in 1942, and in 1946 they renamed it the Smoky Hill Air Force Base. In 1957, they renamed it the Schilling Air Force Base, which is the name that it's living with today. So it's had a lot of names out there. And then it closed in 1965. So from 1965 to 1967, the Department of Justice was in the process of transferring all the property out there to the Salina Airport Authority, which owns about 80% of the land, to the USD 305, which has Salina Area Technical College out there, and then also K-State of Salina and the City of Salina, which we own the right-of-way, all the roads and the utilities and that type out there. So those were the main property owners out at the site. And so from 1942 to 1967, it was a military base. And their job out there was to fight a war. So that's what they had in mind. And really, at the time of the base closure, there really wasn't any environmental laws that resulted with what they were doing out there. So they didn't know what they were doing was wrong, to the best of our knowledge. And so as we move forward, we'll talk a little bit about what happened after the military base closed. So in general, they were in operation for about 23 years, a pretty short time frame. So next slide, please. And so from that time to about the mid-90s, those public entities, the airport, the city, K-State, USD 305 were out there operating, just doing what they do in their normal life. But they determined there were some issues with some underground storage tanks. I think they found over 100 of them. So they investigated that and found that was a problem, so they removed those. And then the Army Corps of Engineers, who was doing a lot of the work out there, conducted some site investigations and found there might be some more issues to deal with. So they kept working on that, and then eventually the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, got involved, and they expanded the site investigation. So 2003, there was some sampling done, and then in 2004, they put this group of people together that was called the Restoration Advisory Board. And I started with the city in about at the end of 2003, so this is about the time I became a city employee working on this project. And this Restoration Advisory Board was a large group of individuals, and their sole purpose was to make sure that the needs of the community were heard. And there was someone that was listening to what we needed here and what we wanted, and about our concerns of the contamination that had been found out there. And next slide, please. So, make sure I'm on the same page. And so, as we move forward, we still deciding if I'm on the same page with her. I think back a few slides. I think maybe you got ahead of me there. One more back, please. Okay, here's where I'll take off from here. So, in 2005, the Army Corps of Engineers, they completed an investigation out at the site. The community and the Salina public entities that have facilities out there reviewed their investigation and felt it wasn't a good investigation. It wasn't solid. They weren't really dealing with the contamination that we had. So the group hired the DRAGUN Corporation out of Michigan to just really review what they said, and there was a lot of errors that were found about that document. And the one that was near and dear to me was that the groundwater contamination that's out at the southwest side of the city where the air base is was moving towards the downtown city public wells in the center of downtown. And the plume had about 1.5 miles before it would reach our area. So there was a lot of argument about how fast will that groundwater move and get to the downtown wells. We have a little safety buffer at our downtown water treatment plant because we put in air strippers in 2000 to deal with benzene and dry cleaners chemicals. So we could treat lower levels of the contaminants that were in play out there, but there was no way we could deal with the really high level contaminants that were being found out at the base. And so we determined a lot more needed to be done if we really wanted to clean up this contamination and do it right. So at that time, we did enough complaining that the Army Corps of Engineers approached the group and really wanted to transfer the project and the responsibility back to the community, which we thought was a great opportunity. Who's going to care more about it than us that live here and work here? And so it continued that the Army Corps of Engineers did some additional investigations out there. We still weren't happy because their thought was, well, let's just leave it as it is and let natural attenuation kind of work its way out, and let's not be concerned. Well, that wasn't going to work for our group. Next slide, please. So here's kind of what they did out there in the time frame. I think back one slide, please. There, okay. I think we're on, hopefully going there. So this is the work that the Army Corps had done out at the site. They'd removed 107 underground storage tanks. They'd removed a transformer, installed an air stripper at the technical college, and also done some subfloor floor ventilation for vapor intrusion at a couple of the schools out there. They'd done some monitoring for about 5 or 6 years, but what we knew from the data that the military activities had really created some havoc in the groundwater and the soil out there. So, next slide, please. I think we're on the same sync now. Thank you. So, in 2012, the Salina public entities reached a settlement with the Department of Justice for that group to take over the ownership and make sure the groundwater contamination was cleaned up. It's probably the first time a small town like Salina, Kansas, if we can call it that, 46,000, 48,000, sued the federal government and won. So they were given the right to take it over. And really out of that, developed a consent decree with the Department of Justice that it's kind of a voluntary agreement that says, we agree, we'll all do this and move forward. And so what the duty was out of that was to develop an investigation of the entire site and do a feasibility study to see really what do we think it costs to clean it up. And so in 2013, we hired the DRAGUN Corporation to do all of that work, and they're out of Michigan. And KDHE is really has a responsibility of, they oversee all of the work that's being done and follow up to make sure that the public health and environment is all taken care of, which is basically their name, Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And so they assume that role, and at the end of all of our work, then they would develop a corrective action decision that would be used to determine what was going to be done at the site. That project cost for that was roughly $9.4 million. That's just to determine, to get our arms around how much contamination is there out there, what's the concentration of it, and how far has it moved. And out of that, the federal government paid the 90% of that, and the community paid for 10%. That was completed about $2 million under budget, so we had some additional money to bring forward for the next work that we're doing. So this slide, she's catching on now. She's keeping up with me. That's great. Thank you. This is the kind of an aerial photo. I'm sure it's hard for you to see from back there. This would be Interstate 35, and they broke the airbase site into 3, they called them operable units. So one was kind of was east of the runways and the airbase to the north end, and 2 was followed to the south. Most of the area, OU3, was on the airbase site. And the significance of this breaking it down was the Army Corps had done a lot of work in OU1, and they had pretty well determined what was going on there. They came to the conclusion there was use and disposal of petroleum products and use of chlorinated solvents, which is really the culprit out there, which is TCE, and it was used as a solvent to clean the planes. And then just the management of how waste was dealt with. So if you think about in war times how many planes came in and out of there, how many gallons of fuel, how many planes were washed, there was a lot of material that was washed off and just found its way onto the surface, onto the soil. Okay, next slide. So kind of going back, they'd really looked at that OU1 and determined pretty much what was going on there, but we just needed to do a little more investigation to really determine how far had it moved. And OU2, there was not a lot of work done, so we had to determine where are all the sources and find out what the concentration was, how far have they moved. And then what made some of those a little more unique, part of that area is in residential areas. So we were looking at, do they have any wells or anything that the contamination could make it to a human? Also was looking at what we call vapor intrusion. And I'll show you some photos later, but basically the vapor comes up through the ground and it could work its way through a crack in the basement of your floor, and you could have that contamination inside your building or in your home, and you could be breathing it. So it was a real concern that we wanted to check on. And then as we get out to the what we call OU3, it was virtually out on the west side of the air base. Not a lot of groundwater issues out there, pretty well restricted, not a lot of access for the public, but there was 3 historic landfills in that area. So that made that kind of unique. Next slide, please. So talk about, they were looking at the soil. So here they drove a probe in the ground, and you can see the soil inside of that probe. And they can actually do some measurements there, and then they can look at how deep that was in the ground. They keep track of all of that, so they know what elevation they hit the contamination, what the concentration was. And you can see them dissecting it up, and they'll be grabbing samples to send off to a lab to be analyzed. Next slide, please. Same thing with groundwater. Lots of groundwater samples pulled. Next slide, please. Did a lot of work with grabbing sediment out of the channels out there, and some surface water. If you think about out there, there's a lot of drainage ditches that you see out there around the air base where you see water moving. So those were some of the areas that we were trying to grab samples and see how much contamination there was out there. Next slide, please. So talked a little bit about soil vapor sample. So you can see, assume this would be your basement floor. We drilled a hole and we're gathering whatever vapors are down here, and it's collected in a canister. And then the air out of that canister is sent off to a lab to be evaluated to find out if any of the contaminants of concern are in there. And you just kind of see them doing the same there. So we'll talk a little bit about how many of all of these types of things we did. Next slide, please. Here's a canister that we're putting inside a home just to see if anything is found up out of the basement and in the living area, trying to make sure it's safe. Next slide. So basically, to kind of summarize, for the first 2014 through 2017 was gathering data. I just had my administrative assistant box that up, getting ready for the next round, and we had, I think, 13, 14 banker boxes that are 3 foot long, filled with data. And a lot of those data is just numbers of looking at all the contamination, whether it's in the groundwater, in the soil, or whatever. So a lot of data was gathered to confirm what do we really have. And you'd expect us to do a lot of work for, you know, $7.5 million roughly. So you'd expect a lot of paper for a result of that, which we did. And this kind of identifies everything that we did there. We sampled 149 existing wells. Those were put in by the Army Corps of Engineers. We installed some new wells. We have some wells that are temporary, that were just short-term to do what we needed to. We had some wells that we pulled groundwater samples from several different levels in the wells to see where the contamination is at. Has it made it down from through the soil into the groundwater? Is it down to the bedrock? We also drilled 3 wells down into the bedrock, and I didn't know you could get water out of a rock, but you can if it has cracks in it. We were able to pump maybe just a small volume of water out of there to confirm whether the contamination had made it down into the bedrock. In certain areas it had. So that gives you an idea that contamination moves on from the soil, down through the soil, into the groundwater and into the bedrock. And then the other thing it does, it moves the groundwater out that area, moves towards the river, which is to the downtown area, so north and east. So when we look at the plume maps of the contamination, you're going to see that's all kind of moving in the direction of the groundwater. So basically, this is what we did for 4 years and about $7.5 million. Lots of data, lots of sampling to confirm what's the real issue. Next slide, please. And so we found there's multiple plumes of contamination out there. We have 11 that are active and that we've really worked and looked at. The culprit was trichloroethylene, the TCE that was used to wash the engines. I'll show you some of the plumes and talk about the concentrations out there shortly. And then all of the other contaminants of concern are everything from tetrachloroethylene, which we call PCE. It's used in a lot of cleaning products too. Vinyl chloride, carbon tet is sometimes used as a fumigation for grain. Chloroform, it's cleaner. And of course petroleum products, who can imagine what was on the ground with all those airplanes taking off, landing out there at the site, and metals. And the one that came up, and this one's a real, at the end, is the pre and polyfluoroalkyls. And we call them PFAS, which is much easier to say, but it's something that just came up in the last couple of years and is gaining a lot of discussion with EPA. But basically it's might be like the coating on a pan so it wouldn't stick, or it prevents staining. But probably the real culprit is it was used in AFFF fire foam. So that was used out at the air base after the Army Corps of Engineers left. So that kind of fell upon those that have property out there, or the city as a whole, to clean that up. The regulations haven't been set yet, but they're very close to doing that, and it's just an add-on piece of equipment as we're doing this job to deal with it. But it's what everybody calls the forever chemical, kind of like what we saw earlier. Once it's in your body, it's there. It doesn't go away. So that's a resemblance I saw of what we talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So I mentioned human health risks. Well, from the standpoint of KDHE, that's really all they're interested in here is the human health and the environment. So we went through and looked at what happens if we do nothing? Well, the results of that were not good. So their real goal is to limit direct contact, ingestion, or inhalation of any of these contaminants to anybody that's currently out there or future individuals. A good share, definitely the TCE and the PCE are cancer risk, carbon tet, several of the others. Some are non-cancer risk, but they rate them to which ones they are. And then with that information, they take and try to resolve, okay, what remedy would be best to solve that risk? But at the end of the day, their whole goal is to reduce the risk to those that might be out in the area. And that's in the groundwater. If this is in the groundwater and someone uses it as a domestic well, there's very stringent requirements to what can be in the water and be safe. We'll look at those numbers shortly. What if someone in the soil was contaminated and they were growing produce? That's a problem. Surface water, there's not a lot of surface water out there, but there is enough that somebody might be encouraged to go through there and play, but not really a lot, so didn't seem quite as much issue. The vapor intrusion was something that we were very concerned about, and we investigated 54 buildings. Part of them were on the airbase site, some of them were commercial buildings, and then about 20, I think, were homes, rough number, that we investigated, because it's really important that we don't have anyone, whether they're students or workers out there or a family, breathing these vapors in, because some of them are there for life with you, and definitely are cancer-causing agents, similar to what we saw earlier. So as we move forward here, I think she got me on my next slide. So what we looked at was all of the remedial actions. What could we do to solve the problems out there? And we looked at it in all of the different medias, from groundwater to soil to vapor to surface water. And one of the things that really became important is we have to not allow individuals to drink that water. So no potable wells in that area that could be something that someone could drink. Prevent the ingestion. And the big thing we looked at was, how do we keep these plumes from migrating? Obviously, we don't want them to find their way downtown to our city well field, because that's without water, it makes Salina kind of a tough place to be. So real important that we dealt with that before it got to the downtown wells. It'd be a lot more costly. Part of the goal out there is to take what we call the hot spots, and that's kind of, or the tea bag, there's a lot of different names for it, but it's the source where the contamination started, and the goal is to deal with that first, is to take care of that so that it doesn't have any opportunity for that concentration to move and cause a larger area to be contaminated. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to do that. And of course, the vapor intrusion is still on our list, and we'll be monitoring that for quite some time. Next slide. So I think I'm finally getting to the part of the project that I really liked, because gathering data for 4 years was incredibly painful and a lot of paper to look at and a lot of numbers. And I've been very anxious, like Mr. Rogers from out at the Salina Airport Authority and many others, to finally do something. Let's solve this problem. It's been years in the making. Let's do something. So now we're going to actually talk about what could we do and how could we solve the problems. So we looked at several different options, and I put these darker dots on there, or boxes. So we're going to look at excavation, whether that's done by a standard device or large boring machines, thermal treatment, direct groundwater recirculation, and in-place permeable barriers or injections, or land use requirements. And I'm going to explain what all of those are, because I'm pretty sure I didn't know what they were till I worked on this project, and so I'll try to help you through that. Next slide, please. So as we talk about excavation, really what we're doing there is going in and just removing the soil in this one area that has a hot spot. And we'll take that soil off-site, we'll stockpile it, and then we'll run some analysis on it and try to characterize it and decide, is it something we can take out to our landfill, or is it hazardous and need to go to a hazardous landfill? Once that's all done, we'll backfill that hole with clean sand and soil. The area that we're looking at here in this particular plume, it's about 10 to 15 foot deep, and it's about 20,000 square feet. So it's about half the size of a football field, to give you an idea of how much soil we're going to dig out, 10 to 15 foot deep. I won't go into a lot of other numbers because they're just numbers on that, but hopefully that'll give you an idea. It's going to be a pretty large hole. So there's an area we'll do that. The next one we'll talk about, this one's kind of unique. It's called thermal treatment, and we actually have done this in downtown Salina on North Santa Fe, where the elevators are. There was a carbon tetrachloride spill. It's fumigant for grain, and Koch Industries cleaned that side up with something similar to this. It's very fast and effective. But basically what you're doing is putting these pipes in the ground, and you heat the soil up to nearly a boiling point so that all these volatile organic compounds kind of vaporize and come out, and then you capture them by vacuuming out of the ground, and then you run them through a treatment system that has activated carbon in to deal with that. And you have to hold this heat in the ground for this process. And some places you put a cover over it to hold the heat in. It takes a lot of electricity, but the good news, in the one plume that we're using it in plume A, it takes about 150 days to do the treatment. And the other one, it's about 240 days. And when I talk about at the end of some of this treatment taking up to 30 years, you can see that's pretty quick to solve a problem. But these are very specific areas. So that's the treatment that we'll be using. Next slide, please. The other is direct groundwater direct groundwater recirculation. It's a lot like pumping the water out of the ground and treating it, except for here we extract the groundwater and we treat it, but we strategically pump it back into the ground or inject it back into the ground to try to push the contaminants to where our wells are that we extract it, so we can kind of manage where the contaminants are and hopefully add some chemicals into that water that'll speed up the process. This is really a complicated project and very expensive. I'll show you some costs on this later. Next slide, please. The other is these permeable reactive barriers. Basically what we're doing there is we have the plume with the contamination, and we either dig out a trench with an excavator and fill it with some material that has some chemicals in it that accomplish the treatment of valiant iron, and we could go on with a lot of names, but I'll forget them tomorrow, and I'm sure you'll wish I didn't say them. And as it goes through that, then it treats the groundwater and prevents it to moving. So what we do is the emplaced ones, or the ones where we excavate out a trench of some depth and put it in, goes down gradient or right near where the source of the contamination is to try to, hold that source in place so we can treat it. And then the ones that are injected, we'll inject the chemicals in the ground with about every 15 foot, and those go out on the far end of the plume where we find little or no concentration. Next slide, please. And so really what we're looking at here is the land use controls, and we have one area that this applies, but really what it is limiting the use of that piece of property for the current property owner and forever. So it's not something that most people would find favorable. So the area that this applies out at the air base is on the Salina Airport Authority property, clear out at the southwest corner of the air base by the runways where the landfills were. There's 3 landfills and 3 different plumes. I think it's I, J, and K. And so those are areas that are restricted, so there's not a lot of chance of somebody building a home or worrying about potable water out there to drink. Access, no one around there, so it's already fenced, so it's pretty limited. So that is kind of what's proposed for that area. So, and the significance of this is along Centennial Ditch or Centennial Road, everything that's to the west towards the air base is non-residential use. Everything from that way on to the east is residential areas. And so it gets a little more stringent requirements for cleanup. Next slide. So I promised you a slide that shows the plumes. So the A through D's and the E's and E's are up in this area. And this plume here, as you can see, has found its way across interstate and over towards this residential area. So we've done a lot of monitoring over there. There's no wells in the area that's used for public consumption. They're all on they drink city water, but concerned about vapors maybe finding their way up into their homes, so we've done work there. And then these plumes down here are ones that have kind of came up through the work that we did, because the Army Corps of Engineers really didn't have those defined. And I know this is going to be really hard for you to see, but these leading edges of these plumes are out in this residential area that was the old air base homes out there. Again, vapor intrusion. This plume here has kind of worked its way, and if you can envision, this is the Menards store. So it's moved, this stuff is, contamination has moved past Interstate 35, but the point is, we grab groundwater samples on a regular time frame, and we test those to make sure, has it moved, as the concentrations change, so that's being continually monitored to know exactly what we're dealing with. So the TCE, I said I'd give you a number. They have, the highest concentration was around 100,000, and we measure in parts per billion. And what's a part per billion? That's even hard to get your head around. That's like 1 second in almost 2 weeks. So I'm not sure, we can really measure to very minute numbers. And in my water system, the limit for TCE is 5 parts per billion. So you can see that's way above anything that we would want. And the goal is 0. And that's really what we treat to in our downtown water treatment plant, is that. And then, of course, we have this wide variety of other contaminants that are in there that we're dealing with, but none of them are to these kind of concentrations that we're dealing with. Next slide. And, well, would you go back 1 minute, please? Thank you. So hopefully this gives you a little guidance of kind of where these plumes are. I forgot to say, these are down there on that corner of the airbase. You can kind of hopefully see the runway, but these are the ones down by the old landfills. That was part of the issue, was how they managed waste, you know, just kind of piled it up, threw it in a hole and put some dirt over it. You know, really wasn't a lot of thought about what it might be. And so, but that area is really restricted, so. Okay, sorry about that. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go through a lot of this, but the KDHE in their corrective action decision determined goals that this is where what we need to treat to in the soil when we're in the residential areas, and these are the areas that they're using in the zone 1. So really, and these are all in parts per billion, as I told you, that 1 second in about 2 weeks. So, but what we really determined that the soil contamination out there really does pose health risks, and to whether you're working out there, whenever we do construction, we always have to caution them to be aware if they notice anything and to do some gas detection to make sure there's no issues or anything coming out of the soil, any of this. And we kind of know where the areas are, and we really haven't had any issues with that. And obviously, soil contamination contributes to groundwater contamination, because that was poured on the ground over time has found its way through the ground and into the groundwater. Next slide, please. So these are just for groundwater, and the numbers under the remedial goals are the ones that I treat the water to downtown. The PFAS, or the new contaminant of concern, it's measured in parts per trillion. I can find anything that I could even give you an example of what that is, but if I convert it to parts per billion, which is what I work with most of the time, it's 0.0007. So that's why it's the one that hangs on forever, and it has a very, very low limit, and that hasn't been set yet. That's a recommended limit. EPA is still working on that number, but the lower the number gives you the idea of how serious it is. So that's a concern of a lot of contaminants. So I think I talked about most of the rest of that. Next slide, please. So these, out of KDHE's decision, these are the treatment processes that they chose based on the data we provide them for costs and the data. So we're in our certain plumes, the ones in the north half or in OU1, they're getting thermal treatment that we talked about, excavation, thermal treatment, and then these are in OU2, and that's in-place barriers. That's same here. And then this groundwater contamination is kind of in that east half, and OU1 and OU2 is the direct groundwater recirculation. Then out at the old landfills, we're just using environmental use controls to protect it. Next slide. So we've been really busy, I think, in the last year or so. KDHE finalized their CAD, or corrective action decision, which is really our walking papers to what needs to be done to clean it up in 2019. We went through a mediation process with the Department of Justice to kind of go back and, you know, threaten to sue them again if we couldn't come to a conclusion. We did go through that process and came to with a consent decree that gave us a settlement of $65.9 million to do the cleanup. And then we have a couple million left over from our previous work, and that was all approved through the district court in January of 2021, which is just a few months ago. We received the $6.9 million from the U.S. government, which is ours to do with as we do best for our community, and I'm here to hope that we can do it for less than like we did the last time, and be real cautious and careful with the community's money. But we do have that money. We've negotiated the new agreement with KDHE, so we know what we have to do. We've got our walking papers, and that's all been approved. We're in the process of negotiating an agreement with the DRAGUN Corporation to do the design work that's identified in the CAD. Next slide. So here's all of those plumes that we've talked about, the type of treatment they're going to get, and then I mentioned groundwater monitoring. We're going to be doing that for years. We'll do maintenance, indoor air monitoring, and then we got to manage all of that data. And then KDHE, we reimburse them for their costs for oversight, and eventually at the end we have to clean this all up and abandon it. But the price tag for this work is $71.7 million. And as we have defined today, again, we got roughly 65.96, about 68 million of money that we're spending. We don't spend it all in year one, so a lot of it will be invested over time. And of course, the interest rates are real good right now, so you know we're getting rich quick. So not so well, but that's the overall cost of the project and what the money's spent for, and we'll be doing that contract with DRAGUN and starting to do that work. Next slide. So here's kind of the schedule of the work we'll be doing. Some of the work, like excavation, how long should it take us to design that and get that in place? It happens pretty quick. So this is really our schedule to get things designed and out to bid. The direct groundwater recirculation, it takes a couple of years to get designed. It's very complicated. If you noticed on the last slide, it had a price tag in that 30+ million. So it's about half of our dollars go into that process. And probably the important thing out of this slide is we'll be doing all of that design by the middle of 2023. Construction should be done with all of these plans by December of 2024. But if you notice all of this monitoring, we'll be doing that to make sure that everything's cleaned up to the standards that were required through the year of 2050. So I guess the moral to the story is it took about 23 years to contaminate it, and we're 28 years nobody was really worried about anything. Everyone else was out using the site, and the underground barrels came noticeable. So then we've spent another 28 years from then trying to figure out what to do. Now we know what to do, and we're going to spend roughly 50 years getting it done. So it didn't take long to do the contamination, but it's going to take a really long time to get it cleaned up. And so we have to monitor this all through the course of the time, and KDHE will provide oversight over us to make sure we're doing our job and that we accomplish our task. So next slide. It's the one you all been waiting for. Sorry, that's a lot of information, and I couldn't find any way to make anything entertaining when you're talking about something that could cause cancer and a health risk and cost $71.7 million. So it's a very serious project, but it's very important to our community, and so I hope you gained something out of that discussion. I'd answer any questions you might have. I know that was a lot of info. Yes, sir?
All those vehicles I see near the airport that are parked out there that seem like they're working, is that part of the excavation? And
no, the work that you see out by the air base right now is pretty close to Schwann's facility.
oh,
They're doing let's see if I can remember, 400,000 square foot addition, about a $500 million project to put in some new pizza lines. And it covers that entire west area of their buildings, very large. It goes about 2 blocks long. So all that work you're seeing is we had to relocate all of the sewer lines. And there's one of them storm drain ditches out there that we have to get new storm drainage in, reroute it around, get that filled in, then they can build their building. So there's a lot of people working out there, but that's what you're seeing. We haven't started on the contamination yet.
but at this time, the groundwater is still safe to drink?
The groundwater that you drink today in the city of Salina, our downtown wells are located downtown along the old river channel. And so that was the whole goal with this. Let's get this stopped, get it cut off, and not let any of that contamination get downtown to our well field, because it'll be a lot more costly to treat down here than to treat there. And we did have the buffer because we treated for that earlier. So the water downtown, I think we analyze it about 80,000 times a year. Every 2 hours somebody grabs a sample. KDHE requires multiple samples every month from us, so the water's monitored on a very regular basis to make sure there's no contaminants in it. And most of the groundwater contamination in the downtown area has been somewhat dealt with, so we don't see a lot of contaminants coming into our treatment plant. But we do have air strippers, big silver things sticking out of the water plant down by the park, or air strippers that remove these volatile organic compounds like we have out here. So the water's safe. I drink it every day. In fact, I got some in my water bottle. So, any other questions? So, well, thank you for enduring that. I wished I could have been entertaining, but I just couldn't think of anything funny to say about this. And I have to say that movie was spectacular. Yeah. It was. It was very. I'm glad I took the time to see it, and I always enjoy coming here to speak for everyone. So thank you for enduring that. If you have any questions, give me a holler at the office in downtown at City Hall. Be glad to talk to you, because if you go home and you think of something you want to know, just if you call down there, they'll find me. Or you'll leave a message and I'll call you back. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you.